Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. It is a pleasure to have you with us as we open another chapter in the annals of criminal history. Today, we delve into one of the most chilling instruments of the underworld, the organized crime hit. These were not random acts of violence. They were calculated executions carried out with cold, ruthless precision. From brazen public displays meant to send a terrifying message to quiet disappearances that enforced a strict code of silence, each hit was a strategic move in a deadly game. We will explore the methods, the motives, and the dark legacy of these events, where loyalty was tested and betrayal was met with the ultimate price. Underscore 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 underscore. Case 1. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The meticulously planned 1929 execution of 7 rivals by Al Capone's gang, cementing his brutal control over Chicago. The city of Chicago, in the winter of 1929, was a kingdom divided. It was the heart of the Prohibition era, a time when the law of the land forbade the sale of alcohol, and in doing so, created an empire for those who dared to break it. The city's streets, slick with ice and ambition, were the battleground for a war fought not with armies, but with gangs, not over territory in the traditional sense, but over the immensely profitable, illicit flow of liquor. 2 kings ruled this fractured domain. On the south side, the undisputed monarch was Alphonse Al Capone. His organization, the Chicago Outfit, was a model of criminal efficiency. It was a corporation built on bribery, intimidation, and, when necessary, brutal violence. Capone was more than a gangster. He was a public figure, a celebrity of the underworld who controlled politicians, police, and a vast network of speakeasies and breweries. He saw himself as a businessman, providing a service the public craved. But beneath the veneer of tailored suits and charitable donations was a foundation of pure, cold-blooded pragmatism. His primary rival, ruling the North Side, was George "Bugs" Moran. Moran was a different breed of gangster. While Capone was of Italian descent, Moran was of Irish-Polish heritage, a holdover from an earlier generation of street gangs. He was known for his volatile temper and a deep, personal hatred for Capone. Where Capone's violence was often strategic, Moran's could be impulsive. Their conflict was not just business, it was personal, fueled by ethnic tensions, betrayals, and a string of bloody attacks and counterattacks that had left dozens dead on both sides. They had tried to kill each other on multiple occasions. Moran's men had famously riddled Capone's headquarters at the Hawthorne Hotel with over 1,000 bullets, an assault that left Capone shaken but unharmed. Capone, in turn, had targeted Moran and his top lieutenants with relentless, methodical precision. By late 1928, the war was reaching its zenith. The stakes were absolute control of Chicago's billion-dollar bootlegging racket. Capone, ever the strategist, decided that the piecemeal approach of picking off Moran's men one by one was no longer sufficient. He needed to deliver a single, decisive blow, a strike so terrifying, so final, that it would not only decapitate the North Side gang but also serve as a warning to anyone who might ever consider challenging his authority again. The plan that began to form in the cold, calculating mind of the outfit's leadership was not for a simple murder. It was for a massacre. The bait had to be irresistible. Moran, perpetually in need of quality liquor for his speakeasies, was known to be a shrewd but greedy buyer. An opportunity was manufactured. A man known to the Northsiders as a hijacker offered Moran's gang an incredible deal, a full truckload of premium old log cabin whiskey hijacked from one of Capone's own shipments at a ridiculously low price. The whiskey was said to be stored in a garage at 2122 North Clark Street, a large, unassuming brick building used by the Moran gang as a depot and front for their operations. The delivery was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. on Thursday, February 14th, St. Valentine's Day. Moran, seeing a chance to profit at his rival's expense, readily agreed to be there to inspect the goods. The trap was set. Capone, meanwhile, ensured he had the perfect alibi. He was conspicuously present at his lavish winter home in Palm Island, Florida. He made a point of being seen, holding court with local officials, and even being questioned by the Dade County solicitor on the very morning of the planned hit. He projected an air of relaxed confidence, a man 1,000 miles away from the brutal machinations unfolding in the frozen north. The morning of February 14th dawned bitingly cold in Chicago. A light dusting of snow covered the city. Inside the garage on North Clark Street, the air was frigid, smelling of grease, stale gasoline, and unburned coal from the pot-bellied stove. The occupants were not the top echelon of the North Side gang, but they were key figures. There was Albert Kachalek, who went by the alias James Clark, Moran's second-in-command and brother-in-law. There were the Gussenberg brothers, Frank and Peter, two of the gang's most feared enforcers, notorious for their violent tempers. Adam Heyer, the gang's business manager and accountant, was also present, along with Albert Weinschenk, a man who bore a striking physical resemblance to Bugs Moran himself, a detail that would prove fatal. John May, a mechanic who did occasional work for the gang, was there, trying to fix one of their trucks. And then there was the seventh man, Dr. Reinhard Schwimmer. He was not a gangster. He was an optometrist, a man fascinated by the dangerous glamour of the underworld. He loved rubbing shoulders with tough guys like the Gussenbergs, perhaps for the thrill it provided, a stark contrast to his mundane life. He was a gangster groupie, a harmless hanger-on who had tragically chosen the wrong day to visit his friends. The seven men waited. Bugs Moran, the primary target, was running late. As he, along with fellow gang members Willie Marks and Ted Newberry, approached the garage, he saw a car that looked exactly like a police detective's squad car parked outside. Believing a raid was in progress, Moran and his companions ducked into a nearby coffee shop to wait it out. It was a simple, chance decision that would save his life. Inside the garage, the men heard the vehicle pull up. They likely assumed it was Moran arriving. Instead, the door slid open to reveal 5 men. 2 were dressed in civilian overcoats, but 3 were wearing the unmistakable uniforms of Chicago police officers. The Northsiders, accustomed to shakedowns and routine raids by corrupt cops, were not immediately alarmed. This was a part of doing business. They likely assumed they would be arrested, pay a fine or a bribe, and be back on the street within hours. The authority of the uniform was absolute. Following the commands of the men they believed to be police, the 7 men inside the garage lined up obediently, facing the cold, painted brick of the north wall. They offered no resistance. They turned their backs, putting themselves in the most vulnerable position imaginable, convinced they were merely following the procedures of a routine police bust. This moment of compliance, born from a familiarity with a corrupt system, sealed their fate. What happened next was not an arrest. It was a ceremony of death. The 2 men in civilian clothes, believed by authorities to be members of Capone's infamous American Boys hit squad, stepped forward. They were armed with Thompson submachine guns, the Chicago typewriter, a weapon whose devastating firepower was synonymous with the city's gang wars. The silence of the garage was shattered by a mechanical, deafening roar. It was not the sound of individual gunshots, but a continuous, grinding wave of noise as the 2 shooters raked their victims from left to right, then back again. Bullets tore through heavy winter coats, flesh and bone, stitching the men to the wall in a spray of crimson. They fell in a tangled heap on the greasy concrete floor. 70 rounds from the 2 submachine guns had been fired in a matter of seconds. But the executioners were not finished. The job had to be absolute. One of the shooters stepped closer, exchanging his empty Thompson for a 12-gauge shotgun. He stood over the writhing bodies of the Gussenberg brothers, 2 men known for their toughness, and delivered a final, brutal coup de grace to each of their heads. The sound of the shotgun blasts echoed like thunder in the enclosed space. Then, there was silence, broken only by the smell of cordite and the slow drip of blood. The execution was as brilliant in its escape as it was in its ferocity. The 2 men in police uniforms prodded the 2 plainclothes assassins out of the garage with their hands raised, as if they were making an arrest. To any witnesses on the street, it looked like a successful police raid. The officers were simply marching 2 captured gangsters out to their vehicle. It was a perfect piece of theater. The 5 men climbed into the Cadillac and drove away, disappearing into the city's traffic, leaving behind a scene of almost unimaginable carnage. The first person to raise the alarm was the landlady, Mrs. Landisman, who lived in an apartment at the back of the building. She had heard the terrible noise but dismissed it as the backfiring of the mechanic's truck. Her tenant's dog, a German shepherd named Highball who was tied up in the garage, began to howl, a mournful, unending cry that finally unnerved her. She sent one of her boarders to check. He opened the door, peered into the gloom, and saw the 7 bodies lying in a pool of blood. The first police officers to arrive on the scene were stunned into disbelief. They were confronted with a tableau of slaughter that surpassed anything they had ever witnessed. It was a human abattoir. The walls and floor were slick with blood. The bodies were so riddled with bullets that they were barely recognizable. It was, as one reporter would later write, a scene from a slaughterhouse. Yet, amidst the absolute devastation, there was a flicker of life. Frank Gussenberg, despite having been hit 14 times by the Thompson and then shot twice in the head with the shotgun, was still breathing. As paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher, Police Sergeant Clarence Sweeney knelt beside him, desperate for a dying declaration. "Who shot you, Frank?" he pleaded. Gussenberg, true to the gangster's code of Omertaith's sacred vow of silence, looked at the officer. His words were a barely audible whisper, a final act of defiance. "Nobody," he gasped. "Nobody shot me." He was taken to the hospital, where he died 3 hours later, taking the identities of his killers to his grave. When news of the massacre broke, a wave of shock and revulsion swept not just through Chicago, but across the entire nation. While the public had become desensitized to gangland violence, this was different. This was not a back-alley shootout between thugs. This was a cold, systematic execution, carried out with military precision and a contempt for human life that was breathtaking. The calculated use of police uniforms made it an attack not just on a rival gang, but on the very symbol of law and order itself. From his home in Florida, Al Capone performed his role perfectly. He expressed shock and condolences, suggesting that Bugs Moran, a man he despised, was likely responsible for killing his own men. "The only man who kills like that is Bugs Moran," Capone told reporters, a masterful piece of psychological misdirection. But no one was fooled. In the underworld and in the press, there was only one name whispered in connection with the crime. As Moran himself, devastated and his power irrevocably shattered, told the police, "Only Capone kills like that." The St. Valentine's Day massacre marked both the apex of Al Capone's power and the beginning of his end. The sheer brutality of the act turned public opinion, which had often romanticized him, squarely against him. He was no longer a charming rogue. He was a monster. The Chicago Crime Commission famously labeled him Public Enemy Number One. The federal government, under pressure from President Herbert Hoover, now made Capone's downfall a national priority. Unable to pin the massacre or any other murder directly on him, they pursued a different angle: his finances. The very crime that was meant to secure his throne made him too notorious to survive. Within a few years, he would be imprisoned not for murder, but for tax evasion. The investigation into the massacre itself was long and frustrating. No one was ever convicted for the 7 murders. The wall of silence was impenetrable. However, forensic science, then in its infancy, provided the strongest clues. Ballistics tests eventually linked cartridge casings found at the scene to 2 Thompson submachine guns. These guns were recovered in December 1929 from the Michigan home of Fred "Killer" Burke, a notorious outfit hitman and bank robber from St. Louis. Burke was a prime suspect, but he was eventually apprehended and convicted for the separate murder of a police officer and died in prison before he could be tried for the Chicago killings. Other suspected shooters included John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, 2 of Capone's most vicious Sicilian enforcers. In a grim epilogue, Capone himself would allegedly murder them just a few months after the massacre. The story goes that he discovered they were plotting against him, invited them to a lavish dinner, and after toasting them, proceeded to beat them nearly to death with a baseball bat before his bodyguards finished the job. Whether this was a reward for their silence or a punishment for their betrayal remains a dark point of mob legend. This St. Valentine's Day massacre was more than just a gangland hit. It became an American myth. It was a brutal punctuation mark at the end of the Roaring '20s, a decade of excess and lawlessness. It exposed the rot at the core of a society that had allowed men like Capone to flourish. The image of 7 men, lined up against a blood-soaked brick wall, became an enduring symbol of the true cost of organized crime. It was a meticulously planned operation of terror that, in its gruesome success, ultimately consumed its creator and changed the course of criminal history in America. The garage on North Clark Street was torn down in 1967, but the story of what happened there on that cold February morning continues to echo, a chilling testament to a day when hate, greed, and violence were delivered with the calculated precision of a professional hit. Underscore 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 underscore. Case 2. The Judge and the Hitman. The 1979 assassination of federal judge John H. Wood, Jr., a contract killing that demonstrated the deadly reach of organized crime into the heart of the American justice system. In the annals of American crime, certain acts transcend mere lawlessness. They are not simply murders or robberies. They are direct assaults on the very foundations of civil society. They are acts of such audacity that they force a nation to confront the power of the forces that fester in its shadows. The event that unfolded on a bright spring morning in San Antonio, Texas, in 1979 was one such act. It was the assassination of a United States federal judge, an act unseen in the country for over a century, and it was a message, delivered with a single bullet, that the underworld's reach could extend into the most sanctified halls of justice. The target was Judge John H. Wood, Jr. To the prosecutors and law enforcement agents who worked with him, he was a bastion of order. To the criminals who stood before his bench, he was a terrifying, almost mythical figure. Appointed to the federal bench for the Western District of Texas in 1970, Judge Wood had earned a reputation that preceded him into every courtroom. His nickname, whispered with a mixture of fear and resentment in prison yards and cartel safe houses, was Maximum John. The name was not an exaggeration. Judge Wood was known for handing down the maximum possible sentences, particularly in narcotics cases, which he viewed not merely as crimes, but as a poison seeping into the fabric of the nation. He was a man of old-fashioned principles, unyielding and seemingly incorruptible. In his court, there was little room for leniency for major drug traffickers. He saw them as merchants of death, and he believed the only appropriate response was to remove them from society for as long as the law allowed. This uncompromising stance made him a hero to some and a mortal enemy to others. The Western District of Texas, which stretched along the Mexican border, was a primary corridor for the international drug trade. The docket of Judge Wood's court was a veritable who's who of the narcotics underworld. He was, by the nature of his work and his character, a man who made powerful enemies. He had received death threats before, so many that they had become a grimly accepted part of his daily life. But Judge Wood was not a man easily intimidated. He continued his work, steadfast and resolute. In the late 1970s, a new kind of kingpin was rising in the Southwest. He was not a quiet, shadowy figure. He was flamboyant, extravagant, and utterly brazen. His name was Jimmy Sugar. Operating out of Las Vegas and El Paso, Sugar was a professional gambler and one of the largest drug traffickers in the United States. His empire was built on marijuana and cocaine, smuggled in massive quantities from Colombia and Mexico. He was not a street-level dealer. He was a CEO of crime, managing a logistics network of planes, boats, and trucks with corporate efficiency. Sugar lived a life of almost cartoonish excess. He owned a mansion in Las Vegas with a disco floor, a private jet, and a collection of luxury cars. He was a high roller at Caesar's Palace, known to win or lose millions of dollars in a single night of gambling. He saw himself as untouchable, insulated by layers of lawyers, shell corporations, and a wall of cash. But his high profile eventually drew the unblinking eye of federal law enforcement. By 1978, a massive federal case was being built against him. He was indicted on charges of masterminding a sprawling drug smuggling operation. The potential sentence was life in prison without parole, and the judge assigned to his case was John H. Wood Jr. For Jimmy Sugar, this was a death sentence. He knew Judge Wood's reputation. He knew that if he were convicted in Wood's court, he would die in prison. From Sugar's perspective, Maximum John was not an administrator of justice. He was an executioner. The prospect of trading his silk suits and Las Vegas suites for a prison jumpsuit for the rest of his natural life was an intolerable one. Sugar was a man who believed that any problem could be solved with money. He had bought silence, he had bought loyalty, and he had bought freedom before. Now, he decided he would buy the death of a federal judge. The plan began to take shape in the desperate mind of a cornered man. Jimmy Sugar was incarcerated at the federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas, awaiting trial, but his influence extended far beyond the prison walls. He reached out to his younger brother, Joe Sugar, a defense attorney in El Paso. Joe was different from his brother. He was a product of the legitimate world, a lawyer who, despite his family ties, had tried to walk a straight path. But the bond of blood and the charismatic pull of his older brother proved too strong. In a series of prison visits, Jimmy laid out his chilling proposal. He wanted Judge Wood dead. He offered Joe a staggering sum of money to find and hire a contract killer. Joe, caught between his fear of his brother and his fear of the law, reluctantly agreed to act as the middleman. The search for a suitable assassin led them into the mercenary circles of the criminal underworld. The name that emerged was that of Charles Harrelson. Harrelson was a professional. He was a contract killer, a gambler, and a charismatic sociopath who had been convicted of one murder for hire and acquitted of another. He was cold, efficient, and utterly without remorse. He was also, in a strange twist of fate that would become a footnote in pop culture history, the estranged father of future Hollywood actor Woody Harrelson. Joe Chigraw met with Charles Harrelson. A price was negotiated. The initial figure discussed was $250,000 and immense sum in 1979, reflecting the extreme risk of the target. Harrelson, ever the professional, began his preparations. He was not an impulsive killer. He was a hunter. He traveled to San Antonio to study his quarry. He learned Judge Wood's routines, his habits, the predictable patterns of his life. He discovered that the judge lived in a condominium complex in the affluent Alamo Heights neighborhood, and that every morning he would leave his home at approximately the same time to drive to the federal courthouse. Wood had refused the protection of U.S. Marshals, believing it was an unnecessary imposition. This decision, born of humility and a refusal to live in fear, would prove to be a fatal vulnerability. Harrelson acquired the tool for the job, a high-powered .240 Weatherby Mark V rifle, equipped with a telescopic sight. It was a hunting rifle capable of delivering a single, devastatingly accurate shot from a significant distance. He practiced with the weapon, ensuring he was comfortable with its mechanics and its power. He was a patient predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on the morning of May 29, 1979. It was a clear, sunny day in San Antonio. Judge Wood, following his unwavering routine, left his apartment and walked toward his car, which was parked in its designated spot in the open-air lot of the Chateau Dijon apartments. He was carrying a briefcase filled with the day's work. The scene was one of peaceful, suburban normalcy. But from a grassy knoll across the parking lot, Charles Harrelson was watching through the crosshairs of his rifle. He had positioned himself perfectly, concealed from view. As Judge Wood bent down to unlock his car door, Harrelson squeezed the trigger. A single shot cracked the morning quiet. The high-velocity round traveled across the parking lot and struck Judge Wood in the small of his back, just below his shoulder blades. The bullet tore through his body, causing massive, unsurvivable internal damage. He collapsed to the pavement, his briefcase spilling its contents beside him. Harrelson, his work done, calmly packed up his rifle, slipped away undetected, and disappeared. The first person to find the judge was a maintenance worker. The initial assumption was that he had suffered a heart attack. It was only when paramedics arrived and turned him over that the small, neat entry wound in his back was discovered. The truth was immediately, horrifyingly clear. This was not a natural death. This was an assassination. The murder of a federal judge sent a shockwave through the United States government. It was an unprecedented act of domestic terrorism. The FBI launched what was, at the time, one of the largest and most complex investigations in its history. Director William H. Webster personally flew to San Antonio to oversee the case. The message from Washington was unequivocal: find the killers, no matter the cost, no matter how long it takes. The assassination was seen not just as the murder of a man, but as an attack on the rule of law itself. If a judge could be executed for doing his job, then the entire judicial system was under threat. The investigation was codenamed DeCase, for deceased judge. For months, investigators seemed to be hitting a wall. They had thousands of potential suspects: every drug lord, every mobster, every major criminal that Maximum John had ever sentenced. The list of enemies was immense. They chased down leads across the country, but the professional nature of the hit left behind very little physical evidence. The break in the case came, as it so often does in organized crime, from within. The pressure of the investigation and the weight of their actions began to fracture the Chigraw conspiracy. Jimmy Chigraw, still in prison, became increasingly paranoid and volatile. He had a falling out with his brother Joe over the payment to Harrelson. Joe Sugar, burdened by guilt and terrified of being implicated in a capital murder, began to crack. The decisive moment came when Jimmy Sugar was finally brought to trial on his original drug charges, this time in front of a new judge in a different state. During the trial, perhaps out of sheer arrogance or a belief that he was untouchable, Sugar made veiled threats against the new presiding judge and the prosecutor. He alluded to what had happened to Judge Wood, boasting of his connections and his power. These boasts were recorded on surveillance tapes, and they provided investigators with the first solid link between Sugar and the assassination. The FBI closed in. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, or even facing the death penalty, Joe Sugar made a deal. He agreed to testify against his own brother and Charles Harrelson. His testimony was the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. He detailed the prison meetings, the plan to hire a killer, the transfer of funds, and the roles of everyone involved. The money trail provided the crucial corroboration. Jimmy Sugar's wife, Jo, had been the paymaster. She had delivered the suitcase full of cash to Charles Harrelson's wife, a transaction that cemented the link between the kingpin and the hitman. In 1982, Charles Harrelson and Jimmy Sugar were put on trial for the murder of Judge John Wood. The trial was a media sensation, a courtroom drama that pitted a family of criminals against the full might of the U.S. government. Joe Sugar's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. He recounted the entire sordid affair, implicating his brother as the mastermind and Harrelson as the triggerman. The defense attorneys tried to portray Joe as a liar, a man trying to save his own skin by sacrificing his brother. They attacked his credibility, but the weight of the corroborating evidence was too much to overcome. The jury found Charles Harrelson guilty of murder and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in federal prison. Jimmy Sugar was acquitted of the murder charge itself. The jury could not definitively place him in the role of ordering the hit beyond a reasonable doubt based on the evidence presented, but he was found guilty of conspiracy to obstruct justice and other charges related to the assassination plot. He was already serving a 30-year sentence on his drug conviction, and the additional sentences ensured he would never be free again. Joe Sugar, for his cooperation, received a 10-year sentence and was released after serving 6.5 years. Jo Sugar was convicted for her role in the conspiracy and payment and was also sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Charles Harrelson would spend the rest of his life in the federal supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. He maintained his innocence until the end, and at one point, in a bizarre and likely drug-fueled confession, he even claimed to have been involved in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, a claim he later recanted. He died in his cell of a heart attack in 2007. Jimmy Sugar was eventually released from prison in 2003 on medical grounds after serving 24 years. He died in 2008 in a federal witness protection program, a final, ironic twist for a man who had once been one of the most powerful and feared criminals in the country. The assassination of Judge John H. Wood Jr. remains a dark landmark in American legal history. It was a stark demonstration of the lengths to which organized crime would go to protect its empire. But it also triggered a powerful response. In the wake of the murder, Congress passed legislation that made killing a federal judge, prosecutor, or law enforcement agent a federal crime punishable by life in prison or the death penalty. Security for federal courthouses and personnel was drastically increased. The government sent a clear message: an attack on one is an attack on all. The legacy of Maximum John is one of courage and sacrifice. He was a man who stood on the front lines of the war on drugs and refused to back down, even when he knew his life was in danger. He was killed for upholding the law, and his death served as a grim but powerful reminder of the stakes involved. The hit was meant to intimidate the justice system, to show that it could be bent or broken by money and violence. Instead, it galvanized it, strengthening its resolve and ensuring that the man who gave his life in its service would not be forgotten. His death was a tragedy, but his story became a symbol of the enduring strength of the very institution he died to protect. Underscore 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 underscore. Case 3. The Canary Who Couldn't Fly. The mysterious 1941 death of Abe Reles, a top Murder Incorporated killer turned government informant, whose fatal fall silenced the most dangerous testimony against the mob. In the ecosystem of organized crime, there are predators and there is prey. There are bosses who give orders from smoke-filled rooms, and there are soldiers who carry them out in dark alleys. But in the late 1930s, a unique and terrifying entity existed within the American underworld. It was not a family. It was not a gang. It was a service. A corporation whose sole business was murder. The press, with its flair for the dramatic, would give it a name that would become legend. Murder Incorporated. This was the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate, the grand coalition of Italian Jewish gangs that governed the criminal landscape of the United States. When a boss in Cleveland had a problem with a rival, when a union leader in Detroit refused to be bought, when a witness in New York needed to be silenced, a call was made. The contract would be approved by a board of directors. Men like the coolly strategic Louis, Lepka, Buckleter, and the brutishly powerful Albert the Mad Hatter Anastasia. Once the order was given, the machine would be set in motion. Murder Incorporated was a model of cold, industrial efficiency. Its killers were specialists, drawn primarily from the tough Jewish and Italian neighborhoods of Brooklyn, like Brownsville and Ocean Hill. They were not flamboyant assassins. They were working-class professionals who killed for a salary and the occasional bonus. They operated with a strict set of protocols designed to ensure anonymity and impunity. A killer from one neighborhood would be sent to perform a hit in another, where he was unknown. The weapons, ice picks, ropes, cheap handguns were untraceable and disposed of immediately. The murders were business transactions, stripped of passion and emotion. They were simply a function of corporate policy. The syndicate's executioners were ghosts, leaving behind bodies but no trails. For nearly a decade, this system worked with chilling perfection, responsible for an estimated 400 to 1,000 contract killings across the country. One of the most prolific and feared cogs in this machine was a man from Brownsville named Abraham Reles. Standing only 5 feet 2 inches tall, Reles was possessed of a disproportionate, feral viciousness. His nickname was Kid Twist, a name he inherited from a previous gangster, and he lived up to its violent reputation. Reles was not a thinker or a strategist. He was a tool, a weapon of pure impulse and brutality. His preferred instrument was the ice pick, which he would expertly jam through his victim's ear directly into the brain, causing a fatal hemorrhage that could be mistaken by a careless coroner for a cerebral aneurysm. He was a creature of the gutter, a man who took a craftsman's pride in his gruesome work. He was talkative, boastful, and utterly without a conscience. He and his crew, known as the Brownsville Boys, were on call, ready to be dispatched anywhere in the country to solve a problem. For years, Reles and his fellow killers operated under a seemingly impenetrable shield of silence and fear. The code of Omerta was absolute. You did not talk to the police. You did not testify. The penalty for breaking this code was a slow, painful, and certain death. The system seemed infallible. But every system, no matter how perfectly designed, has a point of failure. The beginning of the end for Murder Incorporated came not with a bang, but with a whisper. It started with a small-time hoodlum arrested on a minor charge, a man who, under immense pressure, decided to talk in exchange for leniency. His information led to another arrest and another. The man applying this pressure was William O'Dwyer, the ambitious and relentless district attorney of Kings County, Brooklyn. O'Dwyer saw the whispers of a vast, interconnected murder conspiracy and recognized it as the case of a lifetime. He began to systematically roll up the lower echelons of the organization, working his way up the chain of command, one terrified informant at a time. The dominoes began to fall, each one knocking over a more significant piece. Eventually, the investigation led to Abe Reles. In 1940, Reles was indicted for the murder of a small-time candy store owner named Joseph Rosen, a man Lepke Buckalter had ordered killed because he feared Rosen might cooperate with another investigation. The evidence against Reles was strong. Several of his former associates, now in O'Dwyer's custody, were prepared to testify against him. For the first time in his life, Abe "Kid Twist" Reles, the man who had dealt death so casually, was now facing it himself. He was looking at a conviction for first-degree murder, and the mandatory sentence was death in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. The prospect of his own execution terrified Reles in a way that no back-alley fight ever could. The cold, clinical finality of the electric chair was a horror that his brutal mind could not rationalize. He was trapped. On one side was the certainty of execution by the state. On the other was the mob's code of silence, a code that, if broken, promised an equally certain but far more gruesome death at the hands of his former comrades. For weeks, Reles wrestled with his fate in a jail cell. In the end, his instinct for self-preservation, the same primal drive that made him such an effective killer, won out. Abe Reles, one of the most brutal killers in the history of the American mob, made a decision that would shake the underworld to its core. He decided to sing. And sing he did. Reles was not just an informant. He was a living, breathing encyclopedia of organized crime. He possessed a photographic memory, a grotesque gift that had allowed him to store away the grisly details of every contract he had ever been a part of or heard about. From a heavily guarded suite of rooms, he began to talk, and the secrets of Murder Incorporated poured out in a torrent. For 12 straight days, he dictated a 27-page, single-spaced confession, calmly and methodically recounting years of slaughter. He named names, dates, places, and motives. He described the mechanics of the hit squad, the approval process, the methods of payment. He was, as one awestruck prosecutor put it, the best witness that ever lived. The effect of his testimony was cataclysmic. His words were like a wrecking ball, demolishing the wall of silence that had protected the syndicate for so long. Based on his information, dozens of killers and mob figures were rounded up. Trials began, and one by one, Reles took the stand. His testimony was devastating. He was articulate, confident, and unshakable on cross-examination. He spoke of murder with the casual air of a man describing his daily commute. He sent his former friends and colleagues to the electric chair, including his own crew members, Martin Bugsy Goldstein and Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss. His greatest triumph, and the ultimate proof of his value, was the conviction of his own boss, Louis Lepke Buckalter. Lepke was one of the most powerful men in the syndicate, the head of a massive labor racketeering empire. He had been a fugitive, a ghost that federal authorities had hunted for years. Reles' testimony directly linked Lepke to the murder of Joseph Rosen, the very murder that had put Reles in jeopardy. In 1941, thanks to Reles, Lepke Buckalter was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. He would become the highest-ranking and only major American mob boss ever to be executed by the state. Abe Reles had become the government's most prized and most protected asset. He was the key that could unlock any door, the weapon that could bring down any target. And now, District Attorney O'Dwyer aimed him at the biggest target of all, Albert Anastasia. Albert Anastasia was not just another boss. He was the Lord High Executioner, the operational chief of Murder Incorporated. He was the man who ran the day-to-day business of death, a man so feared that other mobsters were said to flinch in his presence. He was the head of one of New York's 5 great crime families, the clan that would one day bear the name Gambino. He was untouchable, insulated by layers of soldiers and a fearsome reputation. But Abe Reles could touch him. Reles was prepared to testify that he had received his murder contracts directly from Anastasia. His testimony was the only thing that could put Anastasia in the electric chair. The mob was in a state of panic. Lepka was one thing, but Anastasia was the heart of the enforcement apparatus. Losing him would be an existential blow. The word came down from the highest levels of the syndicate, likely from men like Frank Costello and Charles Lucky Luciano. Abe Reles had to be stopped. A contract was put out on the star witness's life. The price was said to be $100,000, a king's ransom in 1941. But Reles was seemingly beyond their reach. He was held in what was supposed to be an impregnable fortress. He was quartered in room 623 of the Half Moon Hotel, a faded resort on the Coney Island boardwalk. The entire 6th floor had been converted into a high-security prison. Steel plates covered the windows, and the only way in or out was through a guarded elevator. Reles was under the constant watch of a special detail of 18 of New York's finest police officers, working in teams of 6, round the clock. He was the most valuable and most vulnerable man in the city. He lived a bizarre life, a prisoner enjoying the state's protection, ordering lavish meals and holding court with the detectives who were simultaneously his captors and his bodyguards. He was confident, even arrogant, believing himself to be invincible under the protection of the law. The trial of Albert Anastasia was set to begin. On the morning of November 12, 1941, Reles was scheduled to be transported from the Half Moon Hotel to the courthouse to deliver his damning testimony. It was a day that would have changed mob history. But Abe Reles would never make it to the stand. At 6:45 a.m., a patrolman on the street below the hotel heard a crash. He looked up and saw a shape on the low-slung kitchen extension roof, 5 stories below room 623. It was the body of a man. It was Abe Reles. He was dead, his body twisted from the impact. The man who had sent so many others to their deaths had met his own violent end. The immediate question was, how? How could a man in a locked room, guarded by 6 police officers, end up on a rooftop 5 stories below? The story provided by the police guards on duty was, from the very beginning, deeply suspect. They claimed that Reles, for reasons unknown, had decided to attempt an escape. Their theory was that he had tied 2 bedsheets together, secured one end to a radiator valve in the room, and tried to lower himself to the 5th-floor window below, perhaps to visit a prostitute or simply as a prank. The sheets, they said, had come undone, and he had plunged to his death. They presented as evidence a crude rope made of 2 knotted sheets dangling from the window of room 623. To the public, and especially to the underworld, this explanation was laughable. The inconsistencies were glaring. Why would the state's star witness, a man whose life depended entirely on his protectors, try to escape from them? Where would he go? He was a marked man, hunted by every killer in the country. His only hope for survival was to remain in custody. Furthermore, the physics of the fall didn't add up. His body was found nearly 20 feet out from the face of the building, a trajectory inconsistent with a simple vertical fall. It suggested he had been thrown with considerable force. The bedsheet rope was too short to have reached the 5th floor, and the knot connecting the two sheets was a simple slip knot, one that would have been unlikely to hold even a small man's weight. The behavior of the guards was even more suspicious. At the time of the fall, the 6-man detail was inexplicably depleted and distracted. One captain claimed he was out buying breakfast rolls for the prisoner. Other officers were supposedly asleep or in another room. For a brief but fatal window of time, the most important witness in the country had been left completely unguarded. A grand jury was convened, but the official investigation was a whitewash. The police closed ranks, and their version of events, however implausible, became the official record. The death of Abraham Rellis was officially ruled an accidental death during an escape attempt. No one was ever held accountable, but on the street, everyone knew the truth. Abe Rellis had been silenced. He had been thrown out that window. The mob had gotten to him, right under the noses of his police protectors. The rumors flew. Had a corrupt cop been paid the $100,000 bounty to simply open the door and look the other way? Had mob assassins scaled the walls of the hotel? Or was it simpler? Had one or more of his guards, on the peril of mob boss Frank Costello, simply picked him up and hurled him into the cold morning air? The death of Abe Rellis had immediate and profound consequences. With its star witness gone, the case against Albert Anastasia collapsed. He walked out of court a free man, his power not only intact but enhanced. He had faced down the state and won. He would continue to rule his crime family with an iron fist for another 16 years, until he was finally assassinated in a barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in 1957, a victim of the same kind of mob politics he had so ruthlessly practiced. Abe Rellis became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the underworld for generations. His fate gave rise to a grimly poetic nickname, the canary who could sing but couldn't fly. His death was the ultimate victory for the Code of Silence. It sent an unmistakable message to anyone who might consider cooperating with the authorities. No one is beyond our reach. Not even a man in a locked room, surrounded by police. The law can offer you protection, but that protection is temporary and flawed. Our justice, however, is absolute. The fall of Abe Rellis from the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel was more than the death of one man. It was the murder of a prosecution, a chilling demonstration that in the war between the law and the mob, sometimes the mob wins by simply pushing its problems out the window. Of course, we will proceed. Underscore 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 underscore. Case 4. The Sparks Steakhouse Succession. The brazen 1985 public assassination of Gambino crime family boss Paul Castellano, a dramatic power play that catapulted John Gotti to the throne of New York's underworld. The ambient music transitions. The sound becomes more modern, perhaps with a low, synthesized hum, reflecting the 1980s setting. Slow motion, grainy footage of New York City in the 80s yellow cabs, steam rising from manholes, crowds on busy sidewalks. VO, voiceover, calm, with a deep, resonant quality. Power in the American Mafia is not a birthright. It is not bestowed by committee or won through popular election. It is a thing to be taken. It is earned through fear, maintained through loyalty, and, more often than not, seized through an act of supreme, calculated violence. In the winter of 1985, the city of New York, the undisputed capital of this clandestine empire, was about to witness the most audacious and consequential transfer of power in a generation. It would not happen in a secret meeting room or a secluded basement. It would happen on a public street, in the heart of Midtown Manhattan, under the cold glow of Christmas lights, outside a brightly lit steakhouse. This was to be the coronation of a new king, written in the blood of the old one. The throne in question was the leadership of the Gambino crime family. In the hierarchy of La Cosa Nostra, the Gambinos were royalty. They were the largest, wealthiest, and most powerful of New York's infamous five families. Their influence stretched from the construction unions that built the city's skyline to the docks that controlled its flow of goods. To be the boss of the Gambino family was to be, in many respects, the most powerful criminal in America. For nearly a decade, that man had been Paul Castellano. Big Paul, as he was known, was the hand-picked successor of the legendary Carlo Gambino, his own brother-in-law and cousin. But Castellano was a new breed of Don, a stark departure from the old-world Sicilian godfathers who came before him. He saw himself not as a gangster, but as a businessman. He eschewed the grit of the streets for the plush carpets of the boardroom. His primary interests were in white-collar, rackets construction, concrete, meat distribution, and financial fraud. He lived not in a modest Brooklyn row house, but in a sprawling, opulent 17-room mansion on Staten Island, a white palace so grand it was nicknamed the White House. From this isolated fortress, Castellano ruled his vast criminal enterprise. He was aloof, arrogant, and increasingly out of touch with the soldiers and capos who formed the foundation of his power. He held the street-level rackets, the lifeblood of the family's rank and file, in open contempt. Most significantly, he had issued a strict and absolute edict. Any made member of the Gambino family caught dealing in narcotics would be killed. It was a rule born not of morality, but of pragmatism. Castellano saw the long prison sentences and intense law enforcement scrutiny that came with the drug trade as bad for business. This edict created a deep and dangerous schism within the family. While Castellano focused on his multi-million-dollar corporate schemes, his street soldiers saw the immense, intoxicating profits of the heroin and cocaine boom of the 1980s passing them by. To them, Castellano seemed greedy, keeping the choicest rackets for himself and his inner circle while denying them their chance to earn. He was seen as a weak, corporate boss who had forgotten the traditions and the spirit of the street. This resentment simmered, a toxic brew of ambition and disrespect, waiting for a catalyst. That catalyst was John Gotti. John Gotti was everything Paul Castellano was not. He was a product of the streets of Queens, a charismatic, handsome, and ferociously ambitious captain. Where Castellano was reclusive, Gotti was a man of the people, holding court daily at his headquarters, the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park. He was impeccably dressed, always quick with a smile or a generous tip, but beneath the charm was a core of pure, unadulterated steel. He was an old-school mobster, a throwback who believed in earning, violence, and loyalty in that order. He was a natural leader, and the soldiers who felt abandoned by Castellano flocked to him. Gotti and his crew, including his trusted Lieutenant Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, were everything Castellano despised. They were deeply and profitably involved in the drug trade, flagrantly violating the boss's most sacred rule. They were hijackers, loan sharks, and killers. Gotti knew that he was on a collision course with his boss. The situation was more than just a power struggle. It had become a matter of survival. By 1985, the walls were closing in on both men. A massive federal racketeering investigation, the so-called commission case, was targeting the heads of all five families, including Castellano. The FBI had planted a listening device inside Castellano's White House, and for months, they had recorded his conversations. These tapes were a disaster for Castellano, but they were a death warrant for Gotti. On the recordings, Castellano was heard discussing Gotti's insubordination and the drug activities of his crew. Castellano was under immense pressure from the feds, and it was clear to Gotti that the boss was planning to act. To save himself and appease the government, Castellano was likely to dissolve Gotti's crew and, following his own rule, have Gotti killed. John Gotti knew that he had to strike first. It was a simple, brutal equation: kill or be killed. The only thing holding Gotti back was one man, Aniello Neil Delacroce. Delacroce was the underboss of the Gambino family, a figure of immense respect and fear. He was a pure, street-level gangster of the old school, a mentor to Gotti, and the living embodiment of the family's blue-collar faction. While Castellano was the boss, Delacroce was the heart of the family. He commanded the loyalty of the street crews, and despite his personal disdain for Castellano, he remained loyal to the hierarchy. As long as Neil Delacroce was alive, Gotti could not make a move against the boss. An attack on Castellano would be an attack on Delacroce, and that was unthinkable. On December 2nd, 1985, the final obstacle was removed. Aniello Delacroce died of cancer. The shield was gone. John Gotti was now exposed, and his window of opportunity was open. The final insult, the act that sealed Paul Castellano's fate, came just days later. In a staggering display of arrogance and disrespect, Castellano chose not to attend the wake of his own underboss, a man who had served the family for half a century. To the traditionalists in the family, this was an unforgivable sin. It was a slap in the face to the memory of a revered figure and to every man loyal to him. Gotti seized on this outrage. It was the justification he needed, the final piece of ammunition to convince the other conspirators that the time was right. The king had shown he no longer respected the traditions of his kingdom. He had to be removed. The plot was hatched in secret, in the basements and back rooms of Gotti's territory. With Delacroce gone, Gotti and Sammy Gravano moved with breathtaking speed. They knew Castellano might move against them at any moment. They had to organize the assassination within weeks. A secret is only a secret for so long. They assembled a team of trusted shooters. They secured the approval of some key capos within the Gambino family and sought tacit, unspoken consent from figures in at least 2 of the other 5 families, framing the hit as a necessary evil to remove a weak boss who was hurting everyone. They were breaking the most sacred rule of the Mabu: do not kill a boss without the full approval of the commission, but they were gambling that a successful coup would be forgiven. A failed attempt would mean a war, and their own certain deaths. The plan was as bold as it was simple. They would kill Castellano in public, in a place where he felt secure. The chosen location was Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan. Castellano had a dinner meeting scheduled there on the evening of December 16th with several of his top associates, including his driver and newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bellotti. The public nature of the hit was deliberate. It was meant to be a statement. This was not a quiet disappearance. This was a public execution, a message to the entire underworld that a new and more decisive power was now in charge. The evening of December 16th, 1985, was cold and damp. The streets of Midtown were bustling with Christmas shoppers and office workers heading home. The festive decorations twinkled, casting a cheerful glow on what was about to become a scene of brutal violence. Gotti and Gravano positioned themselves in a car across the street and down the block, close enough to watch, but far enough to be unseen. They were the directors, waiting for the curtain to rise on the final act of their bloody play. A team of 4 shooters, dressed in long, dark trench coats and black Russian-style fur hats to conceal their identities, took up positions near the entrance to the steakhouse. They blended into the evening crowd, just anonymous figures on a busy New York street. Another team of backup shooters was nearby. The communications were handled by a walkie-talkie system. Everything was in place. All they had to do was wait. At approximately 5:26 p.m., a black Lincoln Town car, driven by Thomas Bellotti, pulled up directly in front of Sparks. Paul Castellano was in the passenger seat. As the 70-year-old boss of the Gambino family stepped out of the car and onto the pavement, a signal was given. The lookout, positioned near the restaurant's entrance, alerted the hit team. Time seemed to slow down. From the shadows of the evening rush hour, the four assassins emerged. They moved with a calm, terrifying purpose. They did not run. They walked directly towards Castellano and Bellotti. Before either man could react, before the reality of the situation could even register, the air was filled with the deafening crack of gunfire. The hit was executed with surgical precision. Two shooters focused on Castellano, firing multiple shots from semi-automatic handguns into his head and torso. He fell to the sidewalk, killed instantly, his reign ending on a cold patch of concrete. The other two shooters neutralized Thomas Bellotti as he was getting out of the driver's side, shooting him several times. He collapsed into the street by the open car door. The entire event was over in less than 30 seconds. The shooters showed remarkable discipline. No one else was touched. The bystanders, stunned and terrified, scattered for cover. The assassins, their work complete, did not linger. They calmly turned, melted back into the crowd and the city's labyrinthine streets, and vanished. Across the street, John Gotti and Sammy Gravano watched. Through the walkie-talkie, they received the confirmation. The boss is down. To be certain, Gotti had his driver slowly cruise past the chaotic scene. He looked out the window and saw the body of Paul Castellano lying on the ground, surrounded by panicked onlookers. He saw the end of an era and the beginning of his own. He was now the king. The assassination of Paul Castellano sent shockwaves through New York City and the entire criminal world. It was the most high-profile mob hit in decades, a throwback to the brazen gangland wars of a bygone era. The image of the powerful Gambino boss lying dead on a midtown street was splashed across the front page of every newspaper and led every television newscast. In the days that followed, John Gotti moved swiftly to consolidate his power. He was overwhelmingly acclaimed as the new boss of the Gambino family. He immediately began rewarding those who had been loyal to him and his plot. He was a new kind of boss for a new media age. He was flamboyant, stylish, and loved the camera. The press dubbed him the Dapper Don for his expensive Brioni suits and perfectly coiffed hair, and the Teflon Don after he beat a series of federal cases brought against him. He became a celebrity, a folk hero to some, a man who had taken what he wanted with audacious flair. But his victory was not without consequence. The other families on the commission, particularly the Genovese family under the leadership of the eccentric and dangerous Vincent, the Chin Gigante, were enraged. Gotti had violated the sacred rules. He had murdered a boss without permission. The hit on Castellano was not just a succession, it was a revolution, and it destabilized the delicate balance of power. The Genovese family put a contract on Gotti's life, leading to a 1986 car bomb attempt that killed Gotti's underboss, Frank DeCicco, but left Gotti unharmed. The Sparks Steakhouse assassination was a watershed moment. It was a masterpiece of planning and ruthless execution, a perfect organized crime hit. It elevated John Gotti to the pinnacle of the American underworld. But the very public nature of the act, the very celebrity that it brought him, would ultimately be his undoing. He had made himself the face of the mafia, and in doing so, he became the #1 target of the FBI. The light of the media spotlight casts the darkest shadows, and in those shadows, law enforcement watched his every move. The legacy of that cold December evening, is one of brutal irony. John Gotti seized power through an act of betrayal and violence. Years later, he would be brought down by an act of betrayal. His most trusted confidant, his partner in the assassination, Sammy the Bull Gravano, would turn government witness to save himself. Gravano's testimony would finally pierce Gotti's Teflon shield, sending him to prison for life. Among the many crimes Gravano confessed to and testified about was the murder of Paul Castellano. The brazen hit that made John Gotti the king was the very crime that would ultimately lead to his downfall, a final, fitting chapter in a story of power seized, celebrated, and ultimately lost. Underscore 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 underscore. The stories we have explored tonight are not merely tales of violence. They are examinations of a hidden world, a society with its own brutal codes, its own unforgiving justice, and its own grim consequences. From the calculated terror of a Valentine's Day morning to a judge silenced for his principles, from an informant's fatal fall to a bloody succession on a public street, these events reveal the cold, strategic heart of organized crime. They remind us that behind the myth and the glamour lies a simple, stark reality, a world where power is absolute, loyalty is fleeting, and life is a commodity that can be bought, sold, and ultimately extinguished. These are the chapters written in blood and fear, preserved here in the quiet pages of the Crime Folio. Thank you for joining us in the shadows. We hope you can now find some peace in the light. Sleep well.